Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of WTPN Presents Building Bridges San Francisco. I'm your host, Mark Mosini, and proud to be here again for another delightful and exciting show. Today, I want to go ahead and first start to introduce, of course, my co-host, Jerry Davis, who's always with me doing a wonderful job. Jerry, go ahead and say hello if you want to add a couple things about yourself.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here again. A little background, I guess. I have 4 years of criminal justice administration and judicial proceedings. In school, I worked for WTPN as Executive Director of Special Events, and for Building Bridges, WTPN Building Bridges, as the Assistant Executive Director of Building Bridges. And along with my co-host on two different radio shows here at Building Bridges San Francisco and Building Bridges Orson.
All right, thanks, bud. The aim of our show for Building Bridges is to promote peace, love, unity, and brotherhood throughout the world, and by communicating via an exchange of ideas across cultures and civilizations. I'd like to just get in and introduce our guest now, and I'll save the small talk for later because we are under a time constraint for this particular show. His name is Andy Worthington, and I'm going to give our listeners a background about him and his work. He does some spectacular work that I think is very worthwhile for people to be aware of. Andy is a freelance investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker specializing in Guantanamo and the War on Terror. But he's also covering the global economic crisis, the opportunistic age of austerity imposed in the UK by the Tory-led coalition government, the revolutionary movements in the Middle East, and the Occupy movement. His website is one of the top 100 world politics blogs, which was archived by the British Library in January of 2011, and he receives something over 500,000 page views every month, which is spectacular. In the 6 years while working full-time on Guantanamo and related issues, he worked as a consultant for the United Nations, as the lead writer on a report on secret detention in 2010. He also worked as a media partner with WikiLeaks, which we have all been very aware of recently in the news with Julian Assange, and that was in 2011 where he was working as a media partner, and specifically for the release of classified military files relating to the Guantanamo prisoners, which he subsequently began analyzing in depth for an ongoing 70-part, million-word series, which we'll talk about, and it's quite interesting. In addition, he has worked for NGOs. He was also involved with worked for two NGOs, but he's involved with the third one, Amnesty International, primarily in promoting to student audiences Outside the Law Stories from Guantanamo, the film he co-directed with Paulie Nash. Most recently, he has been working with the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York. In January of 2012, to mark the 10th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo, he established the campaigning website Close Guantanamo with the U.S. lawyer Tom Wilner and with support from a number of prominent lawyers, retired military officials, and human rights organizations. His articles have also appeared in the New York Times, not to mention The Guardian, and many other newspapers. So he is someone who is very well informed about the issues. And Andy, it is an honor to speak to you, and I'm delighted to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for that very nice introduction.
You're very welcome. Yes, I think your work is quite fascinating and interesting, and I want to jump into kind of the first thing I want to talk about here, which is that we've entered into this new millennia and century now, and it seems that world peace is very elusive, and the prospects of it are kind of dwindling even more, I would say. Guantanamo seems to represent something so profound. I mean, it's almost like a microcosm of what is happening in terms of justice around the world. This is a subject that you're very familiar with, as I mentioned in the intro. I mean, there are a number of things we can talk about, but Since you're working and you have worked on Guantanamo, let's start with this issue. For I want to say that could you tell us, give us a quick history of Guantanamo? Why did the U.S. set up this base, and then get into your work into this field?
Sure. Well, Guantanamo is this naval base. It was initially a coaling station in Cuba, which the United States has had for over a century as a result of the war with Cuba and holding on to it afterwards and entering into this strange lease situation which can't be broken unless both parties agree to it. So that's how come the United States is in Guantanamo, and it's why after 9/11 the Bush administration and the lawyers advising the senior officials in the Bush administration came to the decision that Guantanamo would be a good place to hold people without any rights, because they felt that Guantanamo would be beyond the reach of the U.S. courts. That's because technically the sovereignty over Guantanamo, is with the Cuban government. Although in practical terms, every decision that's made about what happens there is in American hands. And, so from the beginning, it was very deviously and cynically for the purpose of holding people without any rights whatsoever, to hold them beyond the reach of the United States courts and of lawyers in the United States, essentially to hold them in a complete legal black hole, because certainly there would be no way that any other international body, for example, would be able to exert pressure on the U.S. government. So it was to hold people without rights. And that remains the fundamental dangerousness of Guantanamo, is that if you're going to deprive somebody of their liberty, there are only two ways to do that. Or there were only two ways to do that. And there are only two ways to do that the majority of sensible and intelligent and principled people would recognize as fair and appropriate. If you're involved in a war, then you can hold somebody humanely until the end of hostilities as a prisoner of war. Otherwise, what you're dealing with are issues that involve criminal behavior. You arrest somebody, you charge them and put them on trial within as short a time as possible. So what the Bush administration did at Guantanamo was to say, we want a third category of human being that doesn't fit into either of these categories, and as I said, are people that we can hold and do what we want to them.
Yes, go on.
Guantanamo, yeah. I mean, do you want me to talk about how I then became involved in it? Or?
Yeah, what got you interested? I feel it's the obvious, which is, this is kind of unprecedented in history, at least U.S. history, to set up such a base for these purposes. So go ahead, and if you could tell us what got you interested.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of people, in the United States and around the world were very uneasy about what's happened at Guantanamo. From the beginning when these guys arrived in the orange jumpsuits with goggles blocking out their vision and with headphones stopping them from hearing anything, and kind of muzzled. It was pretty obvious to anybody looking at it that there was some kind of sensory deprivation going on here with these people who nobody was allowed to know anything about and who were being held in a way that wasn't traditional. It alarmed anybody who was in a position to recognize when lines were being crossed. But, the trick that was achieved by the Bush administration was that they refused to, they kept as tight a lid on Guantanamo as possible, certainly for the first 2.5 years until the Supreme Court said to them that they couldn't continue holding people without rights. But essentially for 2.5 years, they, as I said, they did what they wanted. They tried not to release any information about what was happening there. So it was very difficult for anybody to find anything out. When I began digging was actually in 2005, and I just went through every available piece of documentation I could find about interviews with former prisoners, news stories about prisoners being released, and whatever shreds of information I could muster from the research that lots of people have been doing to try and establish who was there. But the administration hadn't even at that point had to say to the world who it was holding, what their names were, where they came from. But that didn't happen until the spring of 2006. And my work really coincided with the Pentagon losing a lawsuit which was brought by the Associated Press to request information about the prisoners. They lost this lawsuit, and as a result, they had to release the names and nationalities of the prisoners, details about their places and dates of birth, for example, and also thousands of pages of documents. Now, some of these were the allegations that they had built up over these years of interrogation, and others, thousands of pages, were the transcripts of these tribunals and review boards that had taken place at Guantanamo after the Supreme Court said to the administration in June 2004, you can't hold people like this. They have habeas corpus rights. They have the right to know why they're being held. Now, that led the prisoners to be able to have representation from attorneys who were able to come to Guantanamo and meet them. And from that point, really, the total secrecy of the base was lost. But these military tribunals and review boards were actually convened by the Bush administration as a kind of snub to the Supreme Court. They were saying, all right, we'll do some kind of review, but we'll do it under our own terms. But they're fascinating documents because they were the first time that we got to see what people were actually accused of, and the evidence is very flimsy. They also, were the only insight into who these people were, and especially in those cases where the prisoners had taken part in these processes, these tribunals, these reviews, which were not fair. They weren't allowed access to classified information, for example. They weren't allowed legal representation, but they were, if they felt like it, at least able to tell their side of the story. And what happened, strangely, was that after all this information was released, there was a brief flurry of activity and interest in the United States media and in the international media, and then everybody kind of moved on. And it turned out, weirdly, I think, that I was the only person who went, okay, there's 8,000 pages of documentation here. I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to try and find out who these people are, which I did by establishing where and when they'd been captured, and then examining, I suppose on a balance of probabilities, really, what I thought of their stories if they said they weren't who the United States were, and beginning to explore how the authorities had come up with their supposed information demonstrating that these were bad people. And that's really what I've been working at for all those years since. But like I say, it did shock me, and it still does in a way, that it turned out that a completely independent journalist like myself was the only person who forensically tried to examine the information presented by the United States government, reluctantly, but presented, to say, is there any truth to these stories that the administration told the world in 2002? These are the worst of the worst guys. So that's what I've been doing. But, it is, it remains alarming now. I mean, it's a terrible situation we're in now where the United States, the rest of the world has pretty much moved on. Very few people really seem to care about the fact that Guantanamo is still there, nearly 11 years after it opened, that men are still held. But, it's always been depressing to me that a situation that is such an important, such a significant step away from internationally recognized laws and treaties and rules regarding the treatment of prisoners has been marginalized, and like I say, has now almost been forgotten, even though 168 men are still held at Guantanamo.